Everybody about 30, we'll give everyone about 30 seconds to trickle in here. And thank you for joining us for today's webinar. All right. Thanks again for joining. My name is Seth Joyner, Senior Program Manager with the National Committee on North Korea. And I'm happy to introduce today's webinar on the expectations and challenges for the future of North Korea policy in light of the coming change in the U.S. presidency. For those of you who are new to our organization, NCNK is an NGO working to promote peace and security on the Korean Peninsula and improve the lives of the North Korean people. NCNK is a non-governmental, nonpartisan organization whose membership reflects a broad range of perspectives and subject matter expertise related to North Korea. NCNK serves to share information among its members, advance their work, and provide the broader public with substantive and balanced information about North Korea. Today's webinar will be co-moderated by 38 North's Jenny Town and our own Keith Lewis. We're glad to be co-hosting this event with the 38 North program at the Stimson Center, which is an authoritative source for policy and technical analysis on North Korea's internal and external affairs. It aims to facilitate an informed public policy debate about peace and security on the Korean Peninsula and provide policymakers, practitioners, and other stakeholders with data and insights that may enhance understanding of one of the world's most complex security dilemmas. A few last notes of housekeeping before we begin. This event will be recorded. Please don't take screenshots of today's discussion. Thanks so much for your cooperation there. And also, if you, as the audience members, have a question, please use the Zoom's Q&A function. We'll answer questions from the audience towards the end of today's program. I'd like to turn it over now to Keith and Jenny to further introduce our guest speakers, whom we are also very pleased to welcome today, and then to jump into leading what is sure to be an insightful discussion on expectations and challenges for future North Korea policy. Over to you, Keith.
Thanks, Seth, and welcome to everyone. And just to, again, emphasize Seth's point that if any of you have questions along the way, please submit those through the Q&A function, and then we will sort those out to direct to our panelists. So when we discuss the future policy of North Korea on the part of the United States, it seems to me that we actually have a situation of two extremes. First, taking a look at the Democratic National Convention platform. In the platform this year, it stated that President Biden has also worked alongside our allies to counter the threat posed by North Korea's destabilizing development of nuclear and missile programs. Trump took a different approach in the region, embarrassing the United States on the world stage, including by flattering and legitimizing Kim Jong-un, exchanging love letters with the North Korean dictator. And then in the debate with President Trump, Vice President Harris criticized him for his personal rapport with Kim Jong-un. And then in her acceptance speech, Vice President Harris stated, "I will not cozy up to tyrants and dictators like Kim Jong-un who are rooting for Trump." So in terms of this side of the aisle, the question comes up, if the President of the United States will be unwilling to engage with the North Korean leader, what emphasis does that give on risk reduction, for example, on the peninsula? If the President of the United States will not engage with the North Korean leader, what impression or message does this leave with families of American soldiers missing from the Korean War? If the President of the United States will not engage with the North Korean leader, what impression does this message leave with Americans who are involved on the divided family issues and so on? So that's on the Democratic side. Now, I stand to be corrected, but I believe that the Republican platform from the National Convention was silent on the issue of North Korea, and I think silent on the issue of Kim Jong-un. Now, in President Trump's acceptance speech, and I quote, he says, "I got along very well with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The press hated me when I said that, but I got along with him very well." And I was asked, how could you get along with him? Well, you know, it's nice to get along with somebody who has a lot of nuclear weapons or otherwise. In the old days, you'd say that's a wonderful thing. Now they say, how can you possibly do that? But no, I get along with him, and we stopped the missile launches from North Korea. Now North Korea is acting up again, but when we get back, I get along with him. He'd like to see me back too. I think he misses me, if you want to know the truth. And then at a campaign rally in Pennsylvania in August, President Trump again emphasized his ability to get along with Kim Jong-un. And so this raises questions as well. So if Mr. Trump were to be elected and prepares to re-engage with North Korea, number one, given the outcome of the Hanoi summit and North Korean perception that the president walked away, how interested will they be in re-engagement? Number two, if as president, Mr. Trump attempts to re-engage North Korea, would he persist in demanding team support for his policy? This is a challenge that he faced in his first administration when he personally was interested in engaging with the North. A similar challenge faced President George W. Bush when the Track 1 became active. Finally, as president, if Mr. Trump were to re-engage with Kim Jong-un, would he retain ongoing focus and be willing to press on issues, including risk reduction on the Korean Peninsula, American soldiers from the Korean War, divided family issues, and so on? So with that general scene setting, I turn it over to Jenny.
Thanks, Keith. And it's always a pleasure for 38 North to work with NCNK. Many of our staff are members of NCNK, and we really appreciate the work that NCNK does. And thanks for laying out that context. I think it's really helpful to kind of understand what's been said so far in the campaigns. And I'll just add to that, you know, I was in Seoul last week, and it's hard to have a conversation in South Korea these days without talking about US presidential elections. As we really are at a crossroads in relations with a number of countries and at a critical moment in multiple active and potential conflicts and amid some very troubling geopolitical trends. So there's obviously a lot of anxiety about what comes next and understanding understanding who becomes president could have consequential effects around the world. And so we're pleased to have with us three speakers to help us better understand how either candidate might choose to address the challenges and opportunities, especially dealing with North Korea, and where the media narrative or lack thereof may differ from likely policy and practice, and how to think about and prepare for what comes next. So their bios were distributed in the event announcement, but as a quick introduction, Frank Jannuzi is President and Chief Executive Officer at the Mansfield Foundation. He has been since April 2014. He previously served as Deputy Executive Director at Amnesty International USA, and previously served for more than a decade at the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee as Policy Director for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Stephen Yates is a Senior Research Fellow for China and National Security at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. He is also the former president of Radio Free Asia and previously served as a professor of international business and politics at Boise State University. He also formally launched the China Policy Initiative at the America First Policy Institute. And Esther S is the Senior Policy Advisor for Peace and Security at Foreign Policy for America, where she leads on policy related to China, Iran, North Korea, and nuclear issues. And previously, she worked at NCNK on promoting principled engagement between the US and North Korea in the areas of nuclear negotiations, Track 2 diplomacy, and humanitarian engagement. So we're really pleased to have such expertise in the room with us today, in the virtual room with us today. And we're actually, in terms of the format of today's event, we're going to start with a conversation between Frank and Stephen to provide some thoughts on potential administration stances for either Trump or Harris, and then pull Esther into the discussion focused more around the potential role of Congress as we move forward. And just to make clear, none of our speakers are speaking on behalf of any campaigns. These are all their personal opinions based on their experience with many of the people who may be in key positions or interactions they've had with people who may be in decision-making positions going forward. So actually, Stephen, I'd like to start with you. North Korea policy under Trump during his first term was a bit of a roller coaster, right? We went from an era of fire and fury and exchanging insults of Rocket Man and Dotard to high-profile summits in Singapore and Hanoi, during which time Trump boasted of his close personal relationship with Kim Jong-un, to which Keith has already alluded, to really the post-Hanoi turn to a more contentious relations, to essentially prolong stalemate in the last year of Trump's term. So what do you think Trump learned from those experiences that might shape his political appetite and policy approach to North Korea in the second term?
Well, Jenny, thank you for having me on. And I would just say as a caveat at the outset that there is an awful lot that any of us could say about these things. And probably even though our time seems ample, surely I'll leave some things out that I meant to say. And I'm happy to have follow-up in the Q&A or the conversation as it unfolds. There's a lot of context that went into what happened in Trump's first term. Not all of it will apply if he happens to get elected to a second term. There had been the experience of the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations in somewhat differing approaches to North Korea that went before. Everything from trying the agreed framework to leaving the agreed framework to starting the six-party talks to, over the Obama years, somewhat slowing down the pace on those kinds of things. And in some ways, a lot of boxes when it came to trying to approach North Korea had been checked. And yet, what had been assessed to be a regime that was going to collapse in the 1990s hadn't collapsed. A nuclear threat that was dormant but then broke out, and we're dealing with other kinds of things that has grown and it hasn't really abated. And so for Trump's first term, I think we had someone who came from outside of the policy community, if I think would be the most diplomatic way of putting it, trying, well, what if I just went and talked to this person? And before doing so, of course, for those of us that have been on the receiving end, for me, translated versions of North Korean communications, they have a very spicy flavor to the way North Koreans would describe Americans and American leaders. And so in some ways, in shaping the information environment, President Trump engaged in some of that back. And that made some people uncomfortable. It might not be the way people are used to listening to me talk about these kinds of things. But as I said, I think the context was all of these other kinds of approaches had been tried. And I think that the president was arriving at a point of trying something different. And the idea was to sit down in person and to try to present a dramatically different, positive vision of what North Korea or a future Korea could be, and see if there was any legitimate interest on the part of his counterpart in pursuing that. And if so, what might be the steps in doing that? It wasn't concession other than meeting, which some people would consider to be a concession. But there wasn't a change in policy at that point. It was exploration of where are the thought or policy horizons. Now, a lot exchanged. There's a lot that went into both of the big engagements, and we can kind of do pros and cons of that if helpful. But I would, instead of going on too long, I would just emphasize what I see as fundamentally different going into a Trump 2.0. Some of it is the experience of the past. Obviously, the parting at the end of their last gathering was not one of sort of accomplishment or success, other than the president would point out that the coincidence of provocative activity went down during this period of relative engagement. Is that cause and effect or coincidence? It's at least something that is worthy of thinking about, and that might be motivation enough to just try to have another kind of meeting if that is in the offing. But I think that that China under Xi Jinping has gone in a somewhat different direction in their intervening years, and that affects perceptions of allies in Seoul and Tokyo. It affects calculations for the United States. The North Korean involvement with the war in Ukraine, whether it was supporting material or actively participating at this point, depending on what you read now, the closeness of Russia's engagement with Pyongyang is just it's different than what the factors were under Trump 1.0. But the main thing that I would say is that the leadership in Japan and Korea will matter a lot. Under the current leadership in South Korea, I think President Trump would probably find a more overlap in general outlook. There's seemingly new leadership in Japan at a frequent basis these days. But the broad arc of what I would just call the Shinzo Abe adjustment still seems to be churning along, but others may think or know otherwise in terms of the newest prime minister coming in. But the leadership there is going to qualitatively affect the options that a President Trump on a second term thinks he has for maintaining deterrent. But the purpose of the direct engagement is to seek a lessening of tensions while maintaining deterrence and seeing is an alternative path forward possible. And I would just end with, I think the outcome, if there is an outcome with some definition of finality with Russia's invasion of Ukraine or the war in Ukraine, however we want to refer to it, will have a significant impact. If the war in Ukraine is ended and Russia is seen as kind of at least halting violence, the murder there, but even better if they are seen as having not succeeded in that enterprise, then it may have less use for what its play has been to Pyongyang and really even to Beijing in some ways on the Asian flank. So there's a lot of these pieces that just were not present in the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Biden administration, or the Trump 1.0 that I think are going to have a big impact on how this would move forward, other than what the media certainly will capture. What does he say about the leader personally, and does a meeting take place?
Thanks, Stephen. Before we move on, I want to pick up on one point, and certainly the Russia point is a big deal, and we'll come back to that once we bring Frank into the discussion also. But I want to push back on your last point here of how much do you think Trump's personal relationship with Kim Jong-un will play in how he views the challenge, even given the new set of geopolitical considerations that exist today. Oh, you've muted yourself.
That's the problem with getting older and playing with a toggle switch. As I see it, it's really more of a business calculus from the president's point of view. Does he believe that there is something to be accomplished? And if what's meant to be accomplished is a lessening of provocative activity, whether that's missile launches or encroachments at sea or whatever it might be. I mean, obviously, North Korea has done some pretty noteworthy things in cutting off what had been almost permanent notions of seeking eventual unification of the peninsula and this new course of backing Russia in Ukraine. It's a big departure. And so, at least in my estimation, it is. But the president would have to make an assessment of, is there something meant to be accomplished? The logic behind the initial salvo was, had any previous U.S. leader or free world leader actually gone to North Korea and said, look, there's a big positive potential future out there if you'll commit to serious policy change. Now, I may doubt that leader is going to change their calculus, but I think empirically, if you're sitting in the pre-meeting, the president would ask, has anyone tried this? It would have been hard for me to say that at least the president I worked for and President Bush had ever even entertained trying to make that kind of a pitch. It was sort of on the margins of things or tangential. So I don't think that Donald Trump sees this as a personal relationship, as in this is a person I want to go on vacation with. I think he says it as a personal relationship, as in setting up the information environment to sit down and either lessen tensions, or is it possible to pursue this big alternative path. His first go round with this and follow on would, I think, give some skepticism about whether that's possible under current circumstances, but he clearly is someone that believes in direct personal engagement. I would just only emphasize that, at least in my interactions with the people around him, that does not mean leading with concession, other than the meeting itself being perceived by some as being concession.
That's very helpful, and very helpful kind of framing of the situation and how he might approach a second administration. Frank, I want to pull you in here. You know, on the Harris side of the equation, Harris has started her campaign saying she wouldn't change course from Biden's policies, because she had been involved with the decision-making process throughout. Lately, she started to change that narrative and trying to distance herself a little bit more from the Biden administration. But I think in the policy community, I think there's very little belief that Harris would be willing to make major changes to U.S. approach to North Korea. Do you think this assumption is right, or is there more nuance here that would create new opportunities that we're underestimating?
Well, thanks, Jenny, and thanks to NCNK and Stimson for hosting this dialogue, and thanks to Stephen as well, a longtime friend and colleague in service in government and outside of government. No, I don't think there's much prospect that the Harris administration would meaningfully change course from Biden. A number of people smarter than I am have written in the National Interest, in the Diplomat, and other places, thought pieces about the likely Harris approach to the North Korean challenge, and all of them have predicted continuity. What does continuity look like? It means continued emphasis of alliance management, US, ROK, Japan triangle to manage the North Korean nuclear threat. It means doubling down on sanctions enforcement through the new 11-member multilateral monitoring group of Five Eyes plus Japan and Korea, and Australia, New Zealand, basically. It means no summit diplomacy, no gifts of American prestige to the North Korean dictator. And it means an unwillingness to embrace an arms control approach to the North Korean nuclear arms threat, and relying, as Kamala Harris has reiterated publicly, on the goal of complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. This would be in marked contrast, I think, to what Stephen has laid out as a possible Trump approach, which might return to high-level summitry. I'm a little surprised to hear Stephen suggest that the goal of such diplomacy initially would just be tension reduction. I think he's right, that would be the realistic objective of such an outreach. But I remember the days when the Obama and Clinton administrations were trying to deal with North Korea through engagement to secure the agreed framework, or to secure meaningful steps along the pathway toward denuclearization. And the Wall Street Journal savaged the administration, saying that the doves have had their day and we really need to get back to a goal-oriented denuclearization, complete, verifiable, irreversible. So I applaud Stephen. I think we're on the same page in terms of what we think is realistic with today's North Korea. But the notion that a US president would sit down with a North Korean dictator, and what they would accomplish by sitting down with them is not any concrete steps toward denuclearization, any improvement on human rights, any steps to withdraw their forces from Russia, but rather just sort of halt missile testing, perhaps, or diminish tensions on the Korean Peninsula. I think times have changed. Now, having said that, I think Harris would probably promote a continuity with Biden, Obama, strategic patience 3.0, if you will. There are reasons that Stephen enumerated that I want to strongly agree with for why I believe that may not be possible. I don't think North Korea is a passive actor in all of this. North Korea has signed a new treaty with Russia, which they are now operationalizing through the dispatch of North Korean combat forces to Russia and possibly into Ukraine in the conflict. And while I hope certainly that the war in Ukraine might come to an end, I don't think it will. It's already been going on 10 years, likely to go on for another 10 years. This is a game changer with respect to the U.S. prospects, either to sit down with Kim Jong-un to try to reduce tension, or in any way to try to reach out to a North Korean state that has not only signed this new treaty with Russia and thereby gained a significant strategic friend with respect to sanctions, evasion, financial support, fuel, and other things that the North Koreans need, but also military technology, missile technology likely, and all kinds of support from Russia. But it's reframed the sort of the thinking in Northeast Asia, consolidating a Cold War alignment of China, Russia, DPRK against US, ROK, Japan. And so for a US president to try to, go against that through outreach with North Korea seems at odds with the strategic realities. And importantly, there's no evidence that North Korea would accept or have an appetite for such engagement. The Hanoi summit, I think, was pretty much the nail in the coffin with respect to North Korea's interest in strategic normalization of relations with the United States under the leadership of Kim Jong-un. They have broken with the policies of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il and the first years of Kim Jong-un, where I think the goal was maintain an independent nuclear capability, but also attempt normalization of relations with the US to get out from under sanctions and realize a better economic future. I think the situation on the ground is much different now. And the US, frankly, has very little to offer North Korea. And if Kim Jong-un met with Donald Trump, what would Trump offer, that would be of value, to Kim Jong-un? You can't get sanctions relief without congressional support and UN Security Council support, which seems extremely unlikely. It would be breaking faith with the Yoon administration, which has no desire to see a Trump-Kim Jong-un summit. I'm just back from Seoul, by the way. I was in Seoul last week and Tokyo as well. The Yoon administration is petrified at the prospect of a Trump administration, which would simultaneously demand $10 billion of host nation support as extortion for the US ROK alliance, and simultaneously perhaps engage in high-level summitry with Kim Jong-un, undercutting Yoon's efforts to isolate the North and to keep sanctions in force. So, but I do think that basically events are not going to allow a Harris administration or a Trump administration to just remain static. I think that North Korea is going to continue modernization of their armed forces and their nuclear capacity. And three things are going to, I'll close my comment here. Three things are going to drive or necessitate some U.S. adaptation. One is that the DPRK's strategic shift away from normalization with us and alignment with Russia means that the path of normalization and peaceful coexistence with South Korea seems to be no longer an achievable one. Second is that they are operationalizing this relationship with Russia militarily. And little known detail, that the 127th Motor Rifle Division that is hosting the North Korean forces in Russia is based in Primorsky Krai in the Russian Far East along the North Korea border. So it is the very unit that has the closest operational links historically to the North Korean armed forces. That's no coincidence. And this North Korean deployment to Russia is going to yield significant military benefits operationally, I think, to the North Korean armed forces as they gain the first combat experience, meaningful combat experience that they will have had in 70 years. And the third thing that's going to happen is that there's sentiment in South Korea for an independent nuclear capability. And that sentiment is going to grow if there's no progress in denuclearization or capping the North's nuclear programs. So these three sort of developments, I think, are going to drive events on the peninsula. And that means strategic patience is probably not going to be an endurable approach. And it means that symmetry, much as it offers the potential promise of at least calming tensions, may also not really yield the kind of strategic shift on the peninsula that the United States is looking for. So I think the next president, whether it's Harris or Trump, is going to be in a world of hurt on the Korean Peninsula and face some really tough challenges.
Well, thanks, Frank, for laying out a very grim picture. And I agree, especially where the framing of this of, the risks of continuity on our North Korea policy, continuing to do what we're doing, where we don't have a way back towards, diplomacy at the moment. And we won't if we continue this sort of strategic patience 2.0, or however you want to call it, where we're focused on deterrence messaging, we're focused on denuclearization, which the North Koreans right now are not interested in, that we have no engagement at all, right? The risks of continuing this are growing enormously, exponentially by the day. And certainly North Korea's deepening relations with Russia, and now even the fact that there's, North Korean troops in Russia that are, potentially contributing to war efforts. These are all examples of how detrimental it is to stay the course. And it really underscores the outsized influence that North Korea has on global affairs, on global security affairs. It isn't just a Korean Peninsula problem, but really is, having a real notable impact on active wars and on geopolitical trends. And so I think it really begs the question of, where do you see, and this question is for both of you, where do you see North Korea falling in US priorities, foreign policy priorities for either candidate? And do you think there's developments that are going to take place in the next potential month or pre-inauguration that might change that calculus and where North Korea is or should fall on those priorities? And Stephen, maybe I'll turn to you first.
Okay. Well, in my past life, it seemed like the leader of North Korea enjoyed disrupting American holiday seasons and making American government officials have to come back at the end of the year and cut the Christmas and New Year's celebrations to have emergency meetings to figure out what comes next. I don't know what value the trafficking and rumor has these days, but I definitely hear things about calculations of the leader of North Korea thinking he might do a thing or two as a tone setter to try to shake things up before we're going to have a transition on January 20th. It's just really a question of whether it's a transition to Vice President Harris or to President Trump. And so I've heard that. I can't impose my logic onto North Korea's leader, and I definitely don't want to live in his head. But I would say the odds of there being disruptive events are high, but as I think Frank and I both agree, we are already living in very disruptive events. I mean, there's a significant strategic challenge to what North Korea is already doing, almost at the level of when we were wondering would they admit to their nuclear program. And so in some ways, I think it's going to be very hard to put the genie back in the bottle, but to try to somewhat give at least personal perspective of the question you asked about where does North Korea policy or North Korea fit in priorities. I mean, really, North Korea policy has always been a crisis contingency or otherwise a subordinate issue to the bigger either positive agenda of having re-upped or improved our relations with allies, which every administration pays homage to, no matter what their critics might say. Everyone is trying to improve with our cornerstone allies. And then on the other side, every administration has an enormous priority placed on what are we doing to manage the challenges presented by the People's Republic of China. And those are the bigs. And as I've heard some make allusions to in the past, of being a shrimp among whales, there is a certain tyranny to these big accounts dominating, and then North Korea comes into focus when there's a problem. And I've tried to share with friends over the years, one of the reasons why that happens and why it's possibly unavoidable is because it's very easy for small and medium powers to disrupt. And it's very easy to be a problem. And you can become a sort of front page of the newspaper or first item in the president's daily brief by doing something bad. It is much harder to have sustained focus and attention from a president when you're trying to solve problems or you are cooperative. And it's sort of this ongoing challenge of how does a president with immense tyranny of demands and time actually give enough priority to the good players and seeking solutions versus just trying to be crisis manager and deterring a problem. And I think with the Biden-Harris administration and the Trump administration before, you've seen sort of grappling in different ways with that same challenge. Strategic patience is a response to some of that. The summitry of the past was some of that. I guess one of the part I left out earlier too was I really doubt, but who knows, that there would be an immediate lurch toward a summit until there's some clarity about what North Korea's role is in this Ukraine situation at the very least. And I also strongly suspect that there'll be engagement with allies before there is engagement with some of the big foes. But that goes against kind of the media narrative and what a lot of people expect out of President Trump personally.
And that's good to hear because yeah, definitely the media narrative is pushing in other directions. Frank, I want to give you a chance to respond as well.
Sure. It's a good question, Jenny, because it really goes to where on the hierarchy North Korea sits in terms of foreign policy challenges for the Trump or Harris administration. I largely agree with what Stephen said, that North Korea by itself would not normally qualify for the top tier consideration of prioritization. And I think a Harris administration is going to be focused first on Russia, Ukraine, and shoring up U.S. support for Ukraine in the Congress. Second, on the Middle East, where the conflict is both a tremendous political challenge to the administration, as well as a obvious security and humanitarian disaster. And only down the road, third or fourth, will they get around to North Korea. And when they do, the first priority is going to be U.S. ROK Japan, because there will be elections in Korea in 2026. There's a new prime minister in Japan today. There may or may not be another new one in a couple of months or weeks. But consolidating the U.S. ROK triangle is going to be diplomatically important. Institutionalizing that triangular cooperation in advance of political events in the U.S., Japan, and ROK will be a high priority. So all of that makes sense to me. I have to come back to the sort of the presence of North Korean forces in Russia. This is a potentially very significant development. Not only because I don't think that the deployment, if it's becomes a combat deployment, is going to be limited to 3,000 or 12,000 troops. I think you'll see North Korean forces rotating through the combat zone in perpetuity, both to gain combat experience and training, but also, frankly, as mercenaries paid for by the Russian government in technology and cash. Kim Jong-un doesn't give a damn for the lives of his soldiers any more than Putin cares about cannon fodder of Russian troops in the Ukrainian conflict. And this has become a war of attrition, and Ukrainian manpower is very limited. And thousands of North Korean troops as cannon fodder on the battlefield could tip the balance of the war. So this is going to complicate American diplomacy. But here's where I agree with Stephen on his analysis, but I think I disagree on the implications. To me, the presence of North Korean forces in Russia significantly increases the likelihood that a President Trump would make it a high first priority to go to Pyongyang and go to Moscow to abandon Ukraine and attempt to negotiate an end to the war. He would see this as the Nobel Peace Prize that he desperately wants to burnish his personal legacy. And remember, with President Trump, it's not about a policy-driven agenda. It's about a personal-driven, narcissistic, dictatorial, fascistic agenda. And he would love to have a Nobel Peace Prize. And how better to do it than to go to Moscow and Pyongyang, negotiate the end to the war in Ukraine by abandoning Ukraine and compelling them essentially to accept Russian occupation of Donbass and Crimea, undercutting our allies, undercutting our NATO allies, undercutting South Korea and Japan, who have stepped up to try to support Ukraine. I think this is a very real possibility, and I think that the presence of North Korean troops in the battlefield actually makes it more likely, not less, because Trump is not going to face domestic criticism from his base or the Republican Party in the United States for making such a gesture. The Republican Party wants an end to the war in Ukraine. They see the U.S. support for it as a waste of resources. They do not believe that our allies, or Trump doesn't believe that our ally South Korea contributes meaningfully to our global security posture. So that's the concern I have, is that North Korea, is making themselves a more attractive diplomatic target for President Trump by giving him something to negotiate for. The withdrawal of North Korean forces from the battlefield, perhaps the withdrawal of U.S. forces from the Korean Peninsula, and a consolidation of the existing battle lines in Donbass and Crimea, and a compellence on the Ukrainian state to end the war effort. That's a future that terrifies me, but it's one that I think is very realistic, and that it could be a near-term priority for Trump, because he will not have the ability, likely physically, to serve out his second term. So if he becomes president, I would think that he would want to seize the initiative, very early on, to try to have some dramatic win on Ukraine and North Korea.
Okay, so we have two very different versions and visions of what what potential Trump approach to foreign policy challenges, critical foreign policy challenges might be in the next administration, really demonstrating also, again, how consequential this election is and how different the two might approach the situation. I want to throw it back to Keith, though, to pull Esther into the conversation as well, before we get too far into any of this. So Keith, back to you.
Well, Jenny, thank you. If I could, sort of a two-finger approach here. Given Frank's extensive and eloquent remarks just now on the Trump focus, I think we should give Steve a few minutes if you would like to respond to that.
Well, Frank's a friend, and I'll just say in a friendly way, his personal diagnosis of the president is inaccurate. So, but the idea that he's gone through an unprecedented amount of attacks in the United States. A lot of it is focused first and foremost on trying to get things right here. I don't think he has any desire for any award from anyone overseas. And everything that I have heard from what he's gone through in what has come out to be fairly thin gruel as foundations for impeachment from his supporters' point of view and a lot of independent people's point of view, and a lot of that activity going a little bit too far away from the core interests of the American people. It's really more of what his focus is going to be first and foremost, what revitalizes America. It definitely falls into the calculus in terms of overcommitment overseas. That's a historic tension that's always been there. It's a pendulum swing. The major parties switch positions over the decades from time to time. There's always a push and a pull in the pendulum on overextension versus pulling back and regrouping, but it's not isolationism, as it's often referred to in some ways. Frank didn't mention that. So I see this, and the situation in Ukraine is very, very difficult, complicated. There's a lot that can be said and debated about that and what role Europe is playing for Europe itself. In Asia, happily, though, the United States has, I would argue, actually more mature alliances. In some ways, the more established parts of Europe have actually neglected NATO more than anyone can make the case that Japan or South Korea has neglected the alliance with the United States. And so whatever the framing of those renegotiations have been, I've heard pretty sober assessments of respect for those alliances. Will there still be pressure to rebalance risk and reward in those? There certainly will be. But at least in the estimation I hear most, is it's mostly focused on, is there a different result that's achievable in engaging in these parts of the world? So I would just come back to really I think what a lot of people had concerns of, would Donald Trump go it alone? Or would allies be involved? And Shinzo Abe was a very close friend and interlocutor with President Trump through his time in government. There isn't another Shinzo Abe in Japan. There's a different leader now. With South Korean leaders, I remember in the Bush administration when there were changes in leadership, personal relationships between presidents matter. And when those things change and they're difficult, it really changes your policy options. Even if we step back and say the alliances were something. But just with regard to the pursuit for the Hail Mary, I think it's legit for Frank to say that this is something that people worry about. From what I see and hear, I just don't sense that there is this problem of narcissism. In my humble experience, almost all of our top leaders have a higher quotient of narcissism than any of them want to admit. And frankly, from a generally Republican and conservative point of view, the lack of content from the Biden-Harris administration on this and from the Harris campaign leaves at least as many questions about what would actually be done, if anything, because so little has really been addressed on this. And we've had just an insanely, unprecedentedly different presidential campaign that hasn't lent itself to deep details on these things. And in fairness, I'd say the Republican Party, I was a former party chairman. I was a delegate to the 2016 convention and co-chair of the platform subcommittee on national security. And that was at a time when we had platforms that were frankly too long and didn't really serve as any governing purpose. And the Trump approach to the platform this time around was edit down to some core things that would make it a campaign document. This is something that we've debated as a party for a long time. It actually happened this time. And so you end up with this contrast that Keith was highlighting, because that's usually what we would turn to as you've had national conventions. Nominees traditionally have a big shaping impact on that. But Trump edited it way down this time. And there's a rationale for that. But Harris wasn't intended to be the nominee going into that convention. And so we didn't have these traditional fleshing out processes, and we've had fewer debates. And our debate moderators have not chosen to ask about these things very much. So all the way around, I don't think it's been a great service to the electorate or our allies trying to figure out where things might go. But that's my revising and extending of remarks in response to Frank's very friendly but provocative issues.
Jenny, maybe we should extend the session till like 9 p.m., right?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, all right. Esther, as you are aware, we've been hearing about possibilities on North Korea policy under Trump, under Harris. As you are also aware, the Congress will have some say in all of this, whether it's through, shall we say, signing appropriations checks as according to policy development and implementation. But also in North Korea, the Congress does get involved from time to time. As you know, Esther, Congress initially back years ago passed the original North Korea Human Rights Act, 2003, 2004 timeframe. Congress gets involved actively in terms of initiating, passing legislation on sanctions regarding North Korea. There are other areas. But as you've heard Steve and Frank talk about possibilities under either administration, how do you think the Congress would respond either way? Or is North Korea even on the attention span of the Congress at this point?
Great, thanks, Keith. And I hope you and Frank will also jump in here with some comments, being our veteran congressional representatives here. But I think I'll start first with just a few broad comments about Congress generally before getting into specific areas where Congress may be active on North Korea policy. I think, and feel free to argue with me if you disagree, but I don't really see Congress necessarily as the driver of foreign policy. Mostly, I think it is likely and has been and will likely continue to be the spigot through which U.S. policy or a U.S. approach is either constrained or facilitated. And I think, this particular Congress is dealing with a few challenges, broad trends, just to lay out a few. The first being, I don't think we've seen a Congress more deadlocked than in the past due to worsening partisanship. And this kind of dysfunction is leading to, I think, a lack of legislative activity not seen for many decades. And so, I think the ability for Congress, even if it wanted to kind of take a more proactive approach on policy, would be really constrained by the kind of broader partisan politics and the election outcomes. What kind of margin, right, the House has for minority or majority position, whether that, Democrats take back the House, it'll have a slim majority. And so, it's not likely to be able to take, I think, grand policy initiatives. And if Republicans capture the Senate concurrently, I think you'll see that deadlock continue. And kind of the second broader trend is, the foreign policy agenda, as I think Steve and Frank have laid out, that, constrain the president's priority list also constrains Congress, right? The agenda is dominated by other issues: Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, so much so that North Korea is a very, very low priority. And, I think that's also kind of further made less a priority because we have fewer and fewer Korea policy champions in Congress. I think in the past you had members who, were Korean War veterans, had a vested interest in following this issue and kind of making their mark, and you just don't see the same kind of champions in Congress now. And, I think that makes a big difference, right? We saw that with Senator McCain, Senator Kerry, who were integral to kind of the normalization of US-Vietnam relations. But that kind of personal vested interest for Korea and some kind of resolution just doesn't really exist anymore. And I think kind of a third general trend that I'll just mention, I think we're also seeing in Congress a lack of enthusiasm for arms control, supporting arms control. And not that there's not a lack of enthusiasm, but again, I think there's a lack of championing these issues, and you're seeing many more champions of this kind of peace through strength approach, I think, really emerging and taking over the narrative and the agenda. And so I think all of these things are going to really constrain it. That said, I think on North Korea specifically, Congress is a reactive body, and something that Steve said, I think, really resonates, that the only way that North Korea can sustain U.S. attention is through bad actions. And I think that's really, really applicable to Congress as well. Congress will pay attention to North Korea so long as it's acting badly. And I think, and we're seeing this now with kind of the news of North Korean troops in Ukraine and possibly in Russia and possibly Ukraine, is Mike Turner, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, has called on the administration to brief, and it is also even advocating for direct military action against North Korean troops should they enter the fray in Ukraine. And so, I think we're seeing that play out as well. I think moving forward is just kind of a prescription. I think if either President Trump or President Harris were to want to take bolder action on North Korea, I do think cultivating congressional buy-in is going to be key. We saw in the last administration, I think Republican pushback against greater US DPRK engagement was tempered by the fact that you had a Republican president who was championing that issue. And so I think that general political dynamic didn't exist, but you did see efforts by Senators Menendez and others to try and implement some kind of oversight mechanism should negotiations lead to an agreement. And there was a bill that would require the president and his team to brief and submit the agreement, per a timeline that they had laid out. And I think you'll see that return. And I think that becomes even more salient for a potential President Harris, where I don't think she's going to see that kind of political alignment that President Trump enjoyed. And I think she will see a lot more pushback against, if she decides to take a kind of a bolder approach on US DPR engagement. I think she and her team will have to really build up that congressional buy-in, because I think you will see some of that, what we saw with the JCPOA. Those dynamics are really going to hinder her ability to have a flexible hand on US DPRK negotiations.
Thanks, Esther. Frank, based upon your time at the Foreign Relations Committee, do you have any additional comments to add to Esther's presentation?
I think Esther's sized it up just perfectly. I guess I would say that in the absence, I 100% agree that Congress isn't going to drive the policy. I think that Congress will occasionally weigh in on issues that have constituent-driven concerns, and the human rights one is going to be present, no matter who's president. And President Trump spoke eloquently to this in his State of the Union address. I think his first State of the Union address, he had a DPRK escapee in the audience there with him. He spoke eloquently to it when he went to Seoul and delivered a speech, which I don't think he wrote, but someone smart like Stephen wrote it. But it was a very well received speech and a very good speech that laid out the differences between North Korea and South Korea and the human rights issues involved. So I think that no matter who's president, there will probably be voices on Capitol Hill that want to shine a spotlight on that issue, and that may, in some ways, affect both presidents. Or that is to say, no matter who wins, affect their agenda. But apart from that, I don't see Congress having the ability to really either significantly constrain a U.S. president with respect to summitry, nor to significantly drive a normalization agenda, even if they wanted to. So I think they're going to defer to the White House quite a bit.
Thanks. Esther, is there any pending legislation in the Congress presently which you believe related to North Korea in some way, which you believe has bipartisan support?
So, there are a few pieces of legislation right now that are kind of percolating. This Congress, we saw significant action on a bill to establish a national registry to help facilitate the reunion of Korean War divided families, which passed the House earlier this summer. And, my understanding is that, there was supposed to be a SFRC markup on this bill and, laying the foundation for possible Senate action on this. But that's really been stopped by, I think, a broader kind of I hate to use the word dysfunction, but, a broader challenge within, the politics around Israel and Gaza and how that's really holding up committee business on SFRC. And so, I think this gets to the kind of broader point that the politics of this are really tricky. And I'll mention, the North Korean Human Rights Act is up for reauthorization. And that still has not, even though this is a relatively, incontroversial issue, has not been able to get past last Congress or this Congress yet. Obviously, there's still a little bit of time. And possibly in the lame duck, we might see some action on this. But, I think this really encapsulates just kind of a broader challenge of legislative activity, no matter the issue and no matter if it does have kind of bipartisan support. or consensus. And I'll mention also the Bring Our Heroes Home Act, which is pretty incontroversial as well, which is, a bill to kind of declassify and collect the records of missing armed forces and civilian personnel that were lost in various wars, and including the Korean War, that I know many advocates had hoped would get into this particular NDAA, and maybe in other years it might have. But I do think kind of the politics, the way it just has become so difficult, I think, to get normal activity through this Congress is really constraining, I think, the ability to get these smaller, low-hanging fruit through. And if I can just kind of, while I have the mic, one thing I did want to mention, again, pulling from the great commentary from Steve and Frank, North Korea, I think action on North Korea is really going to be subordinate to these broader geopolitical trends. And one thing that I'm kind of monitoring and thinking about is how this might also be used by members of Congress trying to get more support for Ukraine, to use this case of North Korea to make a case to the Biden administration and the lame duck or the next administration for why the US needs to kind of loosen the reins on Ukrainian use of military weapons. As we saw with kind of Mike Turner's recent commentary related to the announcement of the North Korean troops. And so, I think, again, moving forward, we might not see kind of proactive, strategic approach to the North Korea problem, but we're likely to see it kind of woven through maybe these other issues like Ukraine. And even, I think, this broader kind of focus of Congress on US strategic competition with China. I think that these are kind of the channels, I think, in which Congress is going to act on North Korea if it does.
Thanks, Esther. So before we take questions from the audience, a few questions. Jenny, back to you.
So thanks, Keith, and thanks, Esther. That was really helpful to better understand the congressional role in all this. It isn't just the president, but certainly there's a lot of interplay and of course, checks and balances. But I want to throw you all a curveball and take it away from, the broad geostrategic kind of approach to North Korea into a more specific challenge. And that is, obviously, North Korea earlier this year changed its unification policy and its stance towards South Korea. And has really declared itself, a permanent sovereign state, and is taking measures now to put in place new borders and new policies and practices that really push this idea of a permanent two-state solution on the Korean Peninsula. When it comes to US policy towards North Korea, we really have been focused a lot on kind of symptoms rather than a broader strategic goal. We've talked about denuclearization, we talk about human rights, we talk about, defense of South Korea, but we don't necessarily have a broader goal for our relationship with North Korea itself. And I wonder, as North Korea is laying down this challenge to the status quo on the Korean Peninsula, what do you think either the Trump administration or Harris administration response to this is going to be? Is there room for US policy to start to think about a two-state solution on the Korean Peninsula and having a different type of relationship with each of the Koreas? Or do you think there'll be pushback on this or ignore it completely? Frank, I want to turn to you first, kind of on the Harris side, of course, Steve on the Trump side, and Esther, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, on how Congress might respond. But Frank, we'll start with you.
Well, just very briefly, I think no. Embracing a sort of a two-state solution to the Korean Peninsula, it's a great question, Jenny, but because South Korea has not changed their constitution and considers North Korea to be part of a unified Korean state under different government, I don't see any room for a Harris administration to part ways with what would be the consensus viewpoint among progressives and conservatives in Seoul. So I don't see a path for a Harris administration to essentially undercut the Republic of Korea in its long-term remaining ambition to one day see the Korean Peninsula reunified.
Steve?
Well, having spent a lot of my life being lectured to by Beijing about one state versus two states, I am somewhat sarcastically amused at the silence from Beijing at this exceedingly provocative proposal by its ally in Pyongyang, something that should be strictly forbidden among communist parties, I was told. But in substance, I would, in trying to estimate how a future Trump administration might think about this, I mean, it's a real challenge in that America for a long time has not really said what our end objective is in anything that was public. There may be things in different planning documents that haven't been executed, but there's never been anything that said we had a broad notion of a unified democratic peninsula, but under what kind of structure, what have you, all to be determined. And a lot of administrations have basically been trying to just buy time and let circumstances sort themselves out. And we've had at different times in South Korea real ambivalence about did they want unification with the North? Did they want to absorb the problems that might be there in all different forms? And so a lot of American administrations just kick the can down the road. I strongly suspect that somewhat akin to the broader approach to China, I think there are some outlines of what might be the building blocks. There is this controversial notion of there might be dialogue between the leaders, but in the meantime, you would look to contain the malign influences of the other side. That leaves out this idea that comes up every once in a while in some quarters, usually among magazine editors, about regime change, but really just focused more on what can and should be done to contain the malign influences of this provocative non-status quo actor that we are dealing with. And we don't have a fulsome set of tools in that regard, but it's a legitimate topic of conversation among allies. It's a legitimate thing to have between executive and legislative branches. We don't have a solution to how long is the North Korean regime going to last, having been estimated at near demise 30 years ago. And we don't have a good answer for should we push for an outcome now. I think there'd be a strong aversion to pushing for an outcome from the Trump quarters. I don't necessarily hear a push for that from the Harris quarters either. But I think that the trying to look at whether the malign influences are the North Korean forces showing up in Russia and an unhappy participation in the conflict in Ukraine, or the malign influences are provocations involving allies or testing equipment that we didn't want proliferated. These are the malign influences. And I guess the other part that's still to be determined, in the last special envoy for North Korean human rights that I remember being talked about publicly in any meaningful way was Jay Lefkowitz back in the Bush administration. That's not to disparage those who may have filled the position, but he spoke publicly, in some ways daringly, on policy that might have still been under debate within the administration at that time. And it's unclear. And this is a position that wouldn't have existed but for Capitol Hill responding to concerns and making this position exist. In the Biden-Harris administration, I haven't heard really much of a mention of this person, but really I could go back through the Trump and Obama administrations and say somewhat similar things. And so I think it's an open question whether either of the candidates would have a meaningful role to at least talk about and coordinate among allies what our approach is on these human rights issues. And those human rights issues include American citizens. And so I think it's a worthy question to have. And neither campaign, I think, has given any specificity to it at this point.
Now, to be fair, under the Obama administration, there was Bob King, who did a lot of great work and was very active and vocal in that process as a U.S. human rights envoy for North Korea. And the current envoy position was filled late in the administration, but Julie Turner has been also very vocal and very visible since she has been appointed. Esther, I want to go to you.
Yes. And just to note, the last time that this was unfilled was actually the entire duration of the Trump administration. Yep. Despite, kind of the emphasis on human rights that the administration had put early on North Korea. So noting that for the record. And then I would just note for the record, I don't, and about this kind of commentary about whether we have articulated a strategy or future kind of outcome that we'd like to see on the Korean Peninsula. I just point to kind of numerous UN resolutions that the United States and multiple parties have supported regularly since the end of the Korean War that has oftentimes articulated a unified Korean Peninsula as the kind of stated outcome and desire, whether that, obviously times are different. And so whether that continues to be the stated objective will change. But just noting that we have and supported that kind of position before. I think, from a congressional perspective and broader US foreign policy on this particular issue of unification, there is a bill that has been introduced over the last couple of Congresses called the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, which I think in previous years might not have gained the amount of co-sponsors that it has, but it actually continues to increase every Congress, the number of co-sponsors. But it does ask Congress and the administration to lay out a roadmap for a peace agreement on the Korean Peninsula. And so I think, obviously, that's not a direct kind of question on unification, but I do think that bill is an interesting vehicle to have that conversation about what we'd like to see on the future of the Korean Peninsula. And then second, I think just kind of broadly, if I were to kind of suspect what a future US administration would say on this, I think a few things to consider, and I think it was kind of touched a little bit by Frank and Steve, but just to put a finer point on it, what the US government says on the future of the Korean Peninsula on unification, I think has broad implications for Taiwan and China and for even Ukraine and Russia. And I would imagine US administration officials might feel reticent to kind of impose, as they have done in the situation of Ukraine and Taiwan and China, would be reticent to kind of impose what they think should be the outcome, and would prefer the direct parties to articulate that themselves and not have the United States kind of dictate that at this point. And I think that also creates a little bit more flexibility, because I do wonder, if some of this debate about unification and the kind of assistance on unification has kind of left some possibilities for, agreements, peace agreements, and other things, perhaps had not really created the flexibility for that kind of debate. So I think flexibility is key, and by, I think, stating some of those things, we might be cutting that off for ourselves.
Thanks, Keith. I'm going to throw it back to you for audience Q&A.
All right, we'll take a few questions, and then each of our panelists will have opportunity for brief final comments. Richard Kessler asks, or states, the question is, why would Kim engage Trump or Harris, for that matter, but especially Trump, as Kim may feel that Trump dissed him after their last meeting, and Kim has a highly honed sense of ego. Kim would likely want Trump to engage in some form of kowtow. How far would Trump bow to Kim? Steve?
Well, there's a lot of assumptions that go into trying to address a question like that. And I would just say that I don't take it as a given that that Kim seeks a meeting right now. A lot of times in the United States, We are we throw shade on other people as being egotists and narcissists, what have you, but just in general, a lot of Americans assume we're the drivers in some of these things, and sometimes the other party is the one that isn't interested in engagement or is interested in going in a very different direction. And so it very well could be that Kim thinks that the last go around didn't work as he had hoped for him, and he's just not interested. I don't think the United States would get anything out of being the ardent suitor in that kind of a situation. I don't think Donald Trump would personally see any benefit to his image or administration in being seen as the ardent suitor under those circumstances. But I also just don't take the circumstances as we see them today as a given in shaping what the decisions or choices are going to be 6 months from now, after an inauguration, after who knows what other events have transpired, after the Ukraine and Russia situation plays out a bit more. I just think that we just put on the file that this direct dialogue option is obviously open in the thinking of Donald Trump, whereas it seems to be fairly clearly defined out of the option set for Vice President Harris. And people can debate the pros and cons of that, but it seems to be one of the things that we can at least agree is a difference between the two stated approaches. I would also hold out the possibility just because a candidate ran for office saying that for sure they are or are not going to do something is no guarantee of anything any more than it was the case when Ronald Reagan was running in the 1980 cycle. As much as I love and revere President Reagan, he very clearly said he was going to restore diplomatic relations with Taipei, and he most certainly did not do that. So we're in the stages of assessing where there may or may not be opportunities. I expect Kim and the people around him, to the extent they get a say, will be gaming out where they see advantage. And they may try to play to some advantage in engaging Trump if they think they can get it. And I would expect that Trump would similarly look at, is there an advantage to be gained in proceeding? But that's pretty much as simple as I would take the proposition that Mr. Kessler was raising, as best I understand it.
Thanks, Steve. Frank, Jay Brannigan asks, what specific steps would you recommend Vice President Harris, if elected, to take or to propose regarding North Korea?
The steps that I would recommend, Stephen's going to be happy, would basically be to take a risk mitigation approach to the Korean Peninsula rather than attempting final solutions to the problem, because I think we are in a dangerous place. So I think that I greatly doubt that Kim Jong-un is very interested at the moment in risk mitigation. Because I don't think any U.S. president could put on the table sufficient incentives to really bring about a significant change in North Korea's behavior. But nonetheless, it would be worth a try to shut down testing, nuclear testing, missile testing, in exchange for modest concessions, whether that's on sanctions, end of war declaration, diplomatic engagement. I think that is worth pursuing. I don't think it's something the Harris administration is likely to pursue. But if you could isolate the Korean Peninsula challenge from other global challenges, which of course you cannot, that would be the best approach, I think, in isolation to try to help stabilize the situation on the Korean Peninsula. Strategically, I think the play is to try to peel North Korea out of the China, Russia, North Korean strategic bloc. And I don't see good prospects of that happening anytime soon either. But if I were to try to advise Kamala Harris on a more strategic endgame, it would be that, to essentially, bring North Korea out of its dependency on China and Russia, and try to essentially Finlandize North Korea, as opposed to having South Korea be the one that was Finlandized, if you will. So that's where I would advise her. But again, I'm a realist, and I don't see, especially in light of what's happening in Ukraine, I don't see a prospect of that kind of a risk mitigation strategy bearing fruit in the near term.
Thanks, Frank. So given time, there are other questions that have been posed, but we really do want to provide opportunity for each of the panelists to have present any final thoughts or comments. So we will start with Esther, and then Frank, and then Steve.
I was not prepared to go first, but just to reiterate, I do think, as I mentioned, I'll just kind of share some brief thoughts about Congress. As I said at the outset, I don't think Congress is going to be the direct driver of foreign policy, but I do think that they are an important partner. And so whichever candidate wins the presidency this fall, I think it would behoove them to make Congress a good partner for whatever approach that it is taking. And that becomes all the more important, I think, if they want to take a bolder position on engagement, because I think that is where Congress is likely to be the most reticent to be supportive. And so building congressional buy-in, building champions, I think will be an important part. And just to kind of round out on a general comment on Congress, I do worry that we are seeing less and less foreign policy champions in Congress. I think we had a lot of veterans who helped to lay out that contingent in Congress in previous years, but we're seeing less and less national security people with national security backgrounds joining Congress and taking up that mantle. And I think it's important for organizations like NCNK, the think tank community here, even organizations like my current organization. It just kind of proves how important that congressional education engagement is to making sure that Congress is equipped and empowered to be a co-partner on issues related to foreign policy.
Frank?
Well, first, I just want to say that, the audience here is exceptionally learned, and I apologize if the length of my answers, prevented us from getting to more questions from the audience, because the very distinguished audience that you've attracted, Keith and Jenny. Second, I would extend and revise my earlier advice to say that, the other thing that the Harris administration or a Trump administration might try to do on North Korea would be to engage on the humanitarian front on the behalf of American MIA, on behalf of separated families. I think that it might be possible to make some modest inroads on the humanitarian people-to-people agenda, even while setting aside essentially the hope of any progress on the nuclear and security fronts in the near term. And I think that for the human beings involved, the families, and for the separated families, and for the descendants of the Korean War missing in action, I think that would be a very worthwhile effort. And I would hope that either President Trump or Harris would give that a shot. And then finally, I guess I would just say that, gosh, I sure hope Stephen's right with respect to the prospect of a Trump administration essentially approaching the North Korean challenge from a position of careful analysis and a desire to engage only to the extent that American national interests would be advanced through that engagement. I don't share his optimism about how Trump is going to approach governing if he's elected president. But reasonable minds can differ on that, and I hope that he's right. My concern is of a personally driven approach to the peninsula rather than a national interest-driven approach. And we'll see.
Thanks, Frank. Steve?
Well, I just say thank you to the people who have been long-suffering in silence, listening to way too many words and speculations from people like me. But it's been an absolute pleasure to join the conversation. This has been an extremely unusual time in our politics and policy and things happening in the world. And so I think it's a great blessing to be among friends. We don't have to agree on everything, but we agree at least on one thing, that we care about outcomes for the United States of America. We care about outcomes for our allies that have been long-suffering and facing these challenges. And hopefully whatever may come in the weeks ahead, politics is a headache that comes back every once in a while, but our commitment to work together and push for these solutions should endure. And just thank you for having me be a part of the conversation today. And I'm sure I didn't answer all the things people wanted to hear, but we have an endless amount of time left to do that as the weeks and months play out.
Thank you, Steve. So Jenny, in a moment, I'll turn to you to close this out, if you would, please. But before I do so, I would like to thank Caitlin King of your staff, 38 North, the Stimson Center. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Seth Joyner, Marissa McPherson, also Yuri M., one of our members who's very helpful in preparing for today's meeting. So thanks to all of those. Thanks to the audience for being with us. It's really special that you would take this amount of time to be with us today. Jenny, close this out.
Well, thanks, Keith, and thanks to our panel as a whole. I think this was a really interesting and informative discussion about, what to expect. And, none of us know what's going to happen today or tomorrow, much less during the election and the election outcomes. But certainly based on the experience that you all bring to the table, it helps us better understand the nature of the challenges and the potential direction that we're going or that we may go, and to help us better understand where there might be divergences, where there might be opportunities, and what we have to look forward to. So thank you very much. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to NCNK for co-hosting. And we hope that we can do this again after the election, when we do have a better sense of where we might be headed.
All right. Have a good day.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
You.
Thank you all. Thanks, Stephen.